Good morning and afternoon. Welcome to the second book talk of 2025, a series hosted by the America Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation. My name is Esther Rizal Adu, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to mention a few words about the chair. The America Europe Fund strives to be a platform that supports academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research to disseminate and strengthen comparative knowledge of European and American societies. One initiative that supports our mission is the America Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation and International Regulation, which aims to provide interdisciplinary research and expertise on regulatory developments in Europe and America with a focus on technology, innovation, and international regulation. Through these activities, we promote opportunities for cooperation and knowledge sharing amongst stakeholders across the Atlantic. As you can see, today's format is similar to the last book talk we had, which is nicely here displayed, because we had the distinct pleasure of speaking with Dr. Francesca Gueretti, who's currently a research leader at RAND Europe, leading the work on economic security. She's also the host of the podcast Geo-Economic Competition and a joint fellow at the Wadmani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Today's discussion offers a glimpse into the main findings of Dr. Gueretti's recent publication, nicely displayed here, which is Chinese investment and the economic security turn in Europe. In particular, the book provides an instructive framework to understand the process of securitization of Chinese FDI into the EU, the broader implications of this process on EU-China economic relations, and of course, the broader implications on transatlantic economic relations. So, if you'd like to explore this topic further, I cannot stress enough to encourage you to purchase a copy of the book. As displayed here, it was a wonderful read for myself, and I hope it will be for you too. And with that, I'd like to start the discussion by asking Dr. Gueretti, could you give our audience, could you tell our audience a bit about yourself, especially how did you become a leading voice in EU-China economic relations? You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Esther. Well, this is a very difficult question. Have I become a leading voice in EU-China relations? So it's been quite a journey, and I have to be honest, to a certain extent, it happened by chance that I was writing my PhD on a topic that eventually would become of particular relevance in the debate at international level, meaning economic security. So I wrote my PhD about how which is what the topic of the book is basically, and is how an economic means that a decade ago was largely welcomed, which is foreign direct investments, especially foreign direct investments from China, then turned into a security issue. So trying to understand how that transformation happened. And in doing so, I was exploring the relationship between China and the European Union. I came from a China studies background, linguistic, cultural, and economic. And then I developed a little bit of knowledge around the international political economy, put the two together, and did the PhD from which this book is inspired. In my developing this topic, I did a couple of things. One was working for the Italian Institute for Foreign Affairs, leading a project on the impact of the memorandum of understanding between Italy and China of 2019 in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative. So that was sort of the first kind of think tank type of job that I held. And then I moved on to MERICS, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, working again mostly on EU-China relations and economic security. And yeah, dealing with these topics, and then moved to RAND Europe and leading the work on China and on economic security. So it's a bit of a development from the decision of writing a PhD on this topic, and then everything sort of followed suit. Yeah, I think this is more or less it.
Thank you, Dr. Gueretti. So I want to focus on some of the central findings in your book, which is, of course, on the securitization of Chinese FDI into the EU. could you give us a brief overview of the key events that, in your view, precipitated this recent development?
Yes. So it's quite interesting to call it recent in 2025, because if we look back, it's been basically a decade since this debate started. It was definitely more recent when I started my PhD thesis, and now it's been already almost 10 years. There are a couple of things happened. So there was the financial crisis and the euro crisis in 2010, which resulted in the attempt to attract a lot of foreign investments into the European Union to support what was a lagging economic growth. And because China was one of the main actors responsible for dragging the global economy out of that crisis, and at the same time, it was pushing its companies, it was pushing its economy to have better and deeper connections with foreign countries and foreign economies. Now, sorry, I want to clarify something. I don't want to give the impression that all of this was centrally planned. There were some incentives, and there was an environment that was incentivizing going abroad and investing abroad, right? But the environment is indeed complex. So what happened is that in between 2010 and 2015, 2016, we see a growth of Chinese foreign direct investments within the European Union. And that growth of investment at the very beginning was extremely welcomed. It was even sought after by governments, by companies. I mean, many of us probably, definitely me from Italy, remember the time when people told you study Chinese, because if you study Chinese, then you're going to have a job at the end of university, right? That is definitely one of the reasons why I got into China studies. So it was that type of period. And then a couple of things happened, which was still in the 2010s, early 2010s, a lot of Western companies were still investing in China. But in the mid 2010s, there was a realization that China was coming to Europe, and not necessarily just to contribute to Europe's growth, but also this idea of know-how transfer started to circulate. The idea that some of the technological and industrial edge that Europe had had for quite a long time was being transferred into China. The understanding that what was happening was an upgrade of China's industrial capacity from low added value type of production into high added value type of production, which is what in theory Europeans wanted to do. In the meantime, the Made in China 2025, of course, was also published as an idea of upgrading China's production. And so all of these happened, and so the conversation kind of started, and in some countries it started earlier than in others. So if you take France, France had been looking into investment screening for a longer time, not just necessarily in regard to China. But what is widely recognized as the trigger case is the acquisition of KUKA, a robot manufacturer, German robot manufacturer. And why was that a trigger case? That was a trigger case for a couple of reasons. First of all, Germany was one, and to a certain degree still is today, one of the main point of contacts when it comes to the trade relationship between the European and China. The most solid trade relationship is definitely between Germany and China, and as such, it was a very important voice in shaping how the relationship of the whole of the Union went ahead with Beijing and the rest of the country, right? Point number two is that at the time, there was still this coordination between Paris and Berlin when it came to EU foreign policy. So how Paris and Berlin saw certain issues was relevant for where the foreign policy agenda of the European Union would have gone. And finally, third, is one of those instances where, because a regulation needs to happen at European level, but it needs to have all member states, or at least a few member states on board, because implementation happens at member states level, then you need both level on board. So even though if you have a look at conversations within the European Commission, some people were already thinking about investment screening, especially because, again, the French were talking about this tool that they had and that could be used. It didn't quite take shape as something that could be turned into a regulation until Berlin was on board. right? So this was why KUKA was particularly relevant, because it was a bit of an awakening within the German thinking, within the Berlin thinking, and therefore it somewhat enabled what happened then in Brussels. I think this is sort of the key moment. So you have the euro crisis, you have then the acquisition of KUKA, and then of course you have the starting of the debate around adopting a regulation at EU level. And there's one extra step. This year, the EU is reviewing the FDI screening, the regulation that is embedded, the regulation that I talk about in the book. So the review started last year. It will hopefully conclude this year. And in between, what happened was, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit better in a moment, in between what happened was a recognition of economic security challenges, of actions to be done in economic security. And why is FDI screening so important? Is because FDI screening is the first time in contemporary history, so post 2000s, in which Europeans need to put together economy and security, and they need to think about the security challenges of an economic means. So it was that moment of unlocking a conceptualization that wasn't normal, wasn't common before then.
I just want to quickly follow up on your analysis. So apart from these internal dynamics, were there any external factors that also influenced this sudden securitization of Chinese FDI? Because of course, I'm talking from the context of the American fund, where we also focus on EU-US relations. So I wonder if you could add to this.
So a lot of people think that, for example, what was happening in the United States had a major impact on what happened in terms of the time frame in which the European Union adopted the FDI screening regulation. And if you look at the timelines, they sort of match. So it's quite reasonable to think maybe the US FIRMA influenced what happened with the EU framework for FDI screening. Now, FIRMA was updated in 2018. So more or less, if you look at 2019, FDI screening is kind of the same timeline. And I'm not denying that there were exchanges between the US and the EU, but if, for example, we compare it to a recent example, which could be export controls, the process was entirely different. It was a European process, born in Europe out of concerns related to Europe and European strategic assets and European national security, etc., triggered in most instances by cases in Europe that then went outside looking for blueprint, looking for ways to implement this. So is different because when it comes to export control, for example, is something that is born in the US and then has had an influence on the European debate in terms of regulation and in terms of content. But when it comes to FDI screening, at least the FDI screening that was then adopted in 2019, that FDI screening was a European process, which it doesn't mean that there were no contamination in terms of how to draft the regulation or what should be sectors of concern or how an FDI screening should work. But it's not a one-sided process of influence. Is more a contribution to a process that had already been triggered internally.
Wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that. And so just to go back to your book. So in your book, you state that the transformation of Chinese FDI into a security threat was happened through a process, especially through various legal instruments. You already mentioned a couple about some of the legislative and policy debates that are happening, but could you go further into this process by listing some examples, case studies, and their connection to the EU's recent economic security outlook?
Yes, I want to clarify, I'm not a lawyer, so I take these regulations for their value in the securitization process rather than for the content in terms of the legal value of the regulations themselves. So the EU regulation for FDI screening is obviously the main point. The entire book unpacks how the process got to the point where in 2019 the regulation was adopted. But as I mentioned before, there was a French investment screening already happening in France before the adoption and the debate of FDI screening. In the book, I also talk about Italy, the case of Golden Power, which is Italian's FDI screening, and the fact that Italy too had something before this debate, actually way before it was called Golden Share, and it was the idea that the state could give his opinion or stop investments in companies where the country had some stakes. Now this had to change in 2012 due to EU regulations, but this is to say Italy too already had something in place, right? So there were a number of member states that already had some legal frameworks to screen investments. None of these legal frameworks, however, at the time were mostly concerned about foreign investments coming specifically from an actor. And to this day, we need to be clear, no EU regulation explicitly targets a specific global actor. So there's no regulation targeting specifically China. There's no regulation targeting, for example, specific the US, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The regulation is country agnostic. But there are some elements in it that have to do with the role of state-owned enterprises or the role of the state within the enterprise that is investing, or the bilateral relationship with given states that sort of drive that position. That didn't happen before the debate in Europe that happened around the mid 2010s, right? And since then, since the adoption of the regulation, we've seen a flourishing of FDI screening in all of the 27 and beyond. One of the case studies, for example, is the UK, which started as part of the European Union, started a debate as part of the European Union that developed into, obviously, its own system with the National Security and Investment Act outside of the EU. One case that I found particularly interesting is the Netherlands. The Netherlands was actually a couple of things. So the Netherlands had a system, but it was sector specific and it was related to specific concerns. And at the time of the debate around adopting an EU investment screening, it was relatively reluctant in putting together economy and security. It was relatively reluctant in adopting new restrictions. It is much like the UK, an economic liberal type of country, so very liberal in the sense of the least the state is involved into economic matters, the better. Why do I find the Netherlands to be an interesting case is because fast forward to 2021, 2022, then the Netherlands becomes one of the most important countries in European economic security, not only because of export controls and the fact that they adopted new export controls to control the export of advanced lithography machine from ASML, but also because they sort of became one of the drivers of the economic security debate in Europe. So from a country that was trying to adopt as few and as little restriction as possible to a country that understands that some restrictions are needed precisely to make sure that there is predictability while you protect national security and your own advantage, right? The other reason why I find the Netherlands interesting is because post-Brexit, the Netherlands finds itself in a position similar to what the UK had before Brexit, which is one of the preferential partner of conversation in the transatlantic dialogue, right? And in part is something that The Hague wanted explicitly, in part is something that happened in relation again to technological development and a number of other issues, but it kind of becomes one of the frontliners in the transatlantic relationship. And of course, that means also in the debate around economic security. So there is this development of you have a debate at EU level on FDI. So you have a number, let me start again. You have a number of FDI screening mechanisms at national level. Then you have a debate at European level on FDI screening. The number of FDI screening in member states then grow, and even those member states that already had one then update their own regulation to make it up to speed to what was happening in the EU. And then the conversation around economic security is triggered. And so you have the growth of toolbox around around economic security and the coronation to a certain extent of this process on the 30th of March 2023 when the European Commission adopts the EU strategy for economic security. And from then a series of developments since that are still happening and that are still materializing to this day. So the reason why I put so much attention into regulation is because what I've noticed is that a lot of these debates at the end of the day are driven by a legal outcome. So whether it is a regulation, whether it is calling a strategy a legal outcome, I think is a bit of a stretch, if I have to be honest. But it still, is a document that has a deliverable. Without these efforts, many times these kind of debates don't go deep into, so what do we mean by national security? What do we mean by economic security? How do we implement economic security? What are the parameters of definition of these elements? So that is why I pay so much attention to the legal process, and also because the legal process reveals what are the positions of the different actors in the system at the time of adoption.
Wonderful. That actually brings me to my follow-up question, which is, so you've described this multi-level engagement from the national to the regional level when it comes to the securitization of FDI through these various frameworks. But in your research, were economic interests the main drivers for the securitization of FDI from China, or was it a confluence of factors?
This is a great question, and it depends on cases. That's the funny thing. So one of the reasons why I looked into case study is not just because it's the go-to thing for many PhD students, and it's not just because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, it was up to member states to implement these measures, but is because they do have very different, even though they're all part or more or less part of the European Union, they have very different starting points. So you would have countries like Italy and France, and their screening mechanism would be driven by national security concerns. So I'm not saying that national security concerns are not taken into consideration. They're heavily taken into consideration into the regulation. But there will be a very large part also for economic consideration in terms of competitiveness, in terms of industrial advantage, in terms of making sure that you safeguard your home champions. And there are a number of cases related to that have emerged, especially in Italy and especially during the Draghi, when Mario Draghi was prime minister. So you have some of these member states. You have other member states like the Netherlands or countries like the UK, where despite the debate, the truth is that the concerns are heavily about national security, and there's very little space to actually grow that debate or grow that regulation beyond the national security concerns, right? So the economic part, the economic interests, whether it is competitiveness, whether it is defending national champions, and etc., occupies a much, much smaller part of the conversation. So that is indeed about national security. And to be completely fair, also relatively traditional understanding of national security. So that has to do with protection of strategic infrastructure in terms of telecommunication, in terms of energy, cyber security, and espionage, but not company espionage, literally the type of intelligence espionage that is more traditional. So I started this endeavor believing that the economic component would have played a much larger role. So my own internal bias that I was trying to test was, were these people actually advancing national security concerns, or were they using national security concerns to hide economic concerns? And what I found was a mixed picture. In some cases, it was genuinely just national security concerns, and as I just mentioned, relatively traditional ones as well. In other cases, it was clearly also a way to defend economic interests, for sure. But again, it's not an entirely conclusive answer at European level, because depending on the member state, you may have a different type of position.
Just quickly, could you give us an example of where you truly saw the main motivation being economic, and then an example of the traditionalist perspective of national security? especially
Yes,
amongst
in
them?
terms of national security, so Hinkley Point C in the UK, so the nuclear reactor, is a case that was raised and that didn't get blocked, obviously, because at the time the UK didn't have a National Security and Investment Act. But the concerns around that case is what triggered a large part of the debate in the UK, coupled with the debate around Huawei and 5G development, right? So cybersecurity, traditional cybersecurity. So those were the trigger case in the UK, together with what obviously the debate in EU level. So in that case, that is a genuine type of, not a genuine, but a relatively traditional kind of national security. So this is the example in the UK. In the case of where economy definitely play a role, so there's one in-between case. KUKA, as we mentioned, in theory, the concern is about the robot we could be dual use type of technology, right? So that we should have a whole debate about where dual use technologies are in all of these. So the in-betweenness of dual use technologies, is this about national security because they can be applied into military application, or is this about technological advantage? In the case of KUKA, I would say the debate show that it's both, is not just national security and it's not just technological advantage. When it comes to Italy, for example, we saw, and again, it's a bit of borderline, but we saw the Draghi government blocking the acquisition of Iveco, which is a truck maker. They also make tank, to be completely honest, but the acquisition was for the commercial part. So it looked a lot more as if it was a way to protect one of the main manufacturers from Italy rather than trying to protect national security. Now, as I told you, there is definitely a national security element to it, but the impression is that the debate was pivoting towards that economic argument.
Wonderful. So, of course, I want to pivot the conversation in light of current events, especially on its implications of EU economic security, because I did say at the beginning that our discussions offer a glimpse, so that I still encourage our participants to actually buy your book. But of course, your book does provide an interesting framework because seeing the increasing use of investment screening mechanisms across the EU bloc, what opportunities or risk do you foresee, especially in light of the recent focus, especially amongst Commissioner von der Leyen, on bolstering competitiveness in the bloc?
We mentioned how the European Union is undergoing this revision of FDI screening, right? This coupled with well, not coupled with, this is one of the elements that have emerged not only out of the timeline of the regulation itself, so it was due, but also it was embedded in the, I can't remember if 4 or 5 initiatives that are part of the economic security strategy in January 2024, right? So this was one of the initiatives that were mentioned. So investment screening is definitely still a core part of the EU economic security debate, so much so that in the conversation in relation to the review of FDI screening, part of the conversation is what is the role of economic security? The official areas covered by the regulation before the review are national security and public order. So where is economic security? And that as implications, not only for merger and acquisition, so brownfield investments, but also as implication for what may be the role of screening greenfield investments. We've seen recently that, for example, there is a shift in the trend of Chinese investments into the European Union. In the past, there used to be more merger and acquisitions than greenfield investments. Now we see a growth in greenfield investments. This is linked to a couple of things, and one of these, however, has definitely been triggered by the EU adopting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and therefore a push to invest inside the European Union, produce potentially inside the European Union, so to bypass potential tariffs. This has mostly to do with green tech, and we saw investments in especially batteries happening in Spain, in Germany, in Hungary. So this is happening, right? And the conversation around these investments is one of, well, at the end of the day, they bring technologies we don't necessarily have in the European Union. They don't pose a risk to national security or public order, and they can boost employment. So, do we have a case of greenfield investment then is a threat to national security? I would say maybe, not in relation to the batteries, but in relation to other cases. But this is why then the conversation around economic security is triggered. It is basically accepting greenfield investments without any sort of boundary in terms of employment, board composition, regional supply chains, and etc. Is that going to pose a threat to EU competitiveness? Because then the EU doesn't develop that technology and doesn't develop that production. So that is why then in theory, and this is not covered by the book because you have to stop at a certain point and publish, but the EU competitiveness compass in theory brings together these two elements, right? The economic security element and the competitiveness element. The important thing to say, and sorry, I should have said this should have been the first point, in the eyes of the European Commission, in the eyes of DG Trade, the two are separate. Right? So economic security is export controls, is FDI screening, is everything that has a strong national security component or regional security component, right? Everything that has to do with tariffs, anti-subsidies regulations, foreign subsidy regulation, TDIs, trade defense instruments, everything that has to do with the international procurement instrument, all of this toolbox is actually much more related to leveling the playing field, to reciprocity. So it's not about economic security. So that is also the tension that exists within the EU of trying to understand two main things. One is what is and what isn't economic security. And the second one is whether we want measures that traditionally have applied to national security to be expanded to economic security. And this debate is currently happening, so it's definitely not captured in the book and it's really difficult to capture in writing as a done thing. Definitely, if somebody's writing a PhD, this is one of those things that I would definitely monitor and take into consideration. But yes, it's still ongoing.
Wonderful. I'm really glad that you touched upon this tension because it appears to be a question that also has been asked amongst the traditional transatlantic alliance. And I'm pivoting the question, especially on the right of the recent tensions between traditional transatlantic partners such as the EU and US, but also Japan and the US. Could you argue that there's a progression towards securitization within this alliance structure? If so, what key factors attributed to this? So, for example, I'm looking at the Nippon Steel acquisition case as an example of this tension, especially within the traditional Western alliance.
This is a difficult question, and the reason why it's a difficult question, there are two reasons. The first one is that the trend is not consistent. So you have some spikes like the Nippon Steel case. And the second reason is that approach from the United States is developing. So it's not the approach of this administration on economic security seems to be different from the approach of the previous administration. And it's a bit early to say exactly how it will look like in terms of economic security, right? What will be the role of China in the development of the economic security toolbox and approach of the United States is still unclear. How they will use export controls, which was the main focus of the previous administration, is a little bit unclear still. What will be the role of combination between tariffs, tax cuts, and industrial policy? Everything is in development. So in terms of that, I have to pause and say I don't have an answer to that part of the question. As far as the other part is concerned, there's definitely been a securitization of economic interactions with non-partners for sure. So Japan adopted the economic security Protection Act. Sometimes, things go away. The Economic Security Protection Act. Japan is also one of the front runners when it comes to understanding how to create resilience in supply chains. They have this idea of indispensability, meaning being indispensable in global supply chains. So not having to produce everything, but making sure that you produce something that makes you indispensable for global supply chains. You definitely have a development in the European Union previously with the risking, now with the competitiveness compass and everything that has to do with the green agenda as well. What was happening until last year and what is unclear whether will happen in the future was coordination, especially within the G7. So the G7 up to 2024 was becoming one of the key venues where to discuss coordination among partners in economic security. And a lot of conversations were also happening on how to broaden that circle, right? Because at the end of the day, that was 7 economies that definitely could not do everything that was necessary to do in economic security among themselves. So there was a big conversation about what is the role, for example, of the Republic of Korea, or what is the role of African and Asian economies into this conversation, and South American economies as well. So this conversation was happening up until last year. And a lot of the conversation was also around economic coercion. There have been a lot of instances of economic coercion advanced by China. The Republic of Korea and Japan have had a very long experience of this, so they could bring their experience within the G7, help each other, and etc., etc., etc. Now, all of this is unclear where it will go. G7 does not seem to be one of the priorities of the United States at the time being. Canada is the president this year of G7, and obviously they are locked in a complicated negotiation at the moment. So although securitization, up to last year, I could tell you very easily, securitization is happening in these countries, but it's not targeting partners, and it's not even targeting as much, except for the US, quote and unquote, hostile countries, right? It's more about these are our priorities, these are interests, how do we advance them? Now I don't know anymore, because now the concept of economic security is changing. It's really difficult to talk about economic security with the same definition and characteristic that we used to up to last year. And that is why there's a part in the book where I try to differentiate between economic security, economic nationalism, and protectionism, because I do think that that debate will become relevant again in the months to come.
Well, before I close the discussion, members of the audience, if you have any questions for Dr. Goretti, please do not hesitate to drop a question or two on the Q&A box. And with that, I'm really glad that you touched upon the emerging economic security outlook, especially from an international perspective. I know you focused a bit in your answers on the G7, but I wonder what key trends in the global economic security landscape should we look out for, particularly in 2025, whether in the EU or beyond?
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so key trends. I'm not going to mention tariffs. Let's put tariffs on the side for a second. Everyone is talking about tariffs, and it's really important, but let's just put it aside. Again, let's check if the economic security debate transforms into an economic nationalistic debate. What is the difference? So the main difference is that in economic security, you need to address an economic security risk. You are selective. So not all transactions, not all sectors, not all companies will be relevant for economic security. And there is a multilateral aspect to economic security, which was my point, G7, there was a multilateral aspect to it. In economic nationalism, it means that every country is driving the best possible outcome for itself. Country or regional union in the case of the European Union, and security becomes secondary, right? It's about economic security maximalization. Is about your own interest and maximizing your own interest. Now, that is sort of, I think, where we're going at the moment in the debate, but there are a number of things that need to develop in order for it to become an economic nationalist or nationalistic type of framework. The sort of the further point of the spectrum is protectionism, and protectionism is a rejection of opening up, right? Is you just close inside your border, and you reject the idea of opening even when opening would be at your own advantage, right? That is the difference between the two. In economic nationalism, you advance your own interests. So it means that if opening up advances your interest, and you do, in protectionism, you do not do that. So I think that is number one, is see where in the spectrum we're moving. Number two, we're seeing new hubs of manufacturing emerging. And these are important to have a look at, not just in relation to the low added value manufacturing, which is definitely something that we're seeing happening, especially in places like Vietnam, right? But the added value manufacturing as well. Technologies, especially components for emerging technologies, are developing. And we have places like India, we have places like Indonesia, again, places like Vietnam, where we do see a lot that is happening, and whether in the next 5 years these will become technological hubs for global value chains, I think is an important element to keep an eye on. And I would say these are the things that I would highlight. I don't want to put anything else out there, because again, as I told you, it is March 2025 and a lot is still developing.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Goretti, for your wonderful remarks and cautious analysis of what will occur in 2025. And with that, we've entered the Q&A section. So if you have any questions to ask to Dr. Goretti, please do not hesitate to drop a question in the Q&A box. In the meantime, I'll get started because I already received a question beforehand. So looking at the state of current transatlantic relations, as aptly marked by Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, do you foresee a further divergence on economic security policy towards China compared to the US, or a degree of alignment? I contextualize this question because I remember from another discussion, there are almost distinct approaches here in the EU compared to the US. For example, here in the EU, we talk about de-risking, while in the US, there are approaches around decoupling. So what is your take on this?
There were a lot of differences even before the change of administration. The main one is that the US, through its regulations, was able to target China directly, and wanted to target China directly, either through a list of hostile countries or, targeting specifically China. This is something that the EU doesn't do, EU member states don't do, and therefore that it seems like a trivial thing, but it does create an additional hurdle, especially administrative hurdle at European level. Because while in the US, for example, if you put export controls against specific items that go into China, you only have to check those items. In the case of the EU, you adopt export controls on specific items that go anywhere, which means that in theory, you have to check all of them. Same for investment. In some cases, you can check on investments from China. In the EU, you cannot do that, right? You have to check investments that are in the list of sectors or in the list of items, depending on the member state, that have been identified, whether they come from China or whether they come from the US. So that was a difference before. The other difference is that there was starting to begin an alignment, definitely for sure, between the US and the EU in terms of the role that China played in the economic security risk matrix. But China has always been a priority for the US, sort of number one competitor and number one concern, especially due to the Indo-Pacific element of it all. For the EU, China is definitely, and was in the past for sure 3 years, the main concern, but it's not the same degree of concern, right? The element of national security is a little bit more gray, is a little bit more difficult to grasp, is a little bit less direct. That kind of shifted, obviously, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and China's non-condemnation of the invasion and China's support of Russia changed that paradigm, but it was already there. Now, and as you mentioned, the difference between de-risking and decoupling, even though Sullivan had adopted de-risking, small yard, high fences type of paradigm, a lot of alignment was happening at narrative level in terms of the actual measures. Another example is urban investment screening. Very difficult for the European Union to understand how to do urban investment screening, whether it is even needed to begin with. Countless examples of where the two had differences before as well. Now, the problem now, and I think it is a main problem, is unpredictability. As I mentioned before, we don't clearly know at the moment what the role of China, for example, in the future regulations in the US will be. We know that the selection of people in the administration have still view China in a relatively hostile through a relatively hostile lens. We know that the first administration from Trump was the one that started the trade war between China and the United States. But this is a different administration from the one that was elected in 2016, right? So unpredictability is point number one, and that creates a real issue and at the same time incentive in the European Union, because if we look at a lot of the economic security debate that happened in the EU in the past 3 to 4 years, with the exception, of course, of FTA screening, which started before, it was largely driven by the debate in the United States. So we did a lot in relation to that. And now it is unclear if we have to go alone or whether we will be able to coordinate with Washington still. So unpredictability and unclarity are the keywords of the first few months of 2025.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Gretti. Well, we have an interesting question by Leila Kumerma, which asks, what does the EU's turn towards economic security mean for the global economic regime, considering the US's apparent withdrawal from it under Trump 2.0 and China's challenge to existing rules and principles?
To be completely honest, I don't think it changes much again from what was happening in the years past. It is more formal. It does mean that, for example, WTO is much more explicitly threatened. But in conversations with US officials in the previous administration as well, at closed door, every time you'd mention the WTO, they'd be saying WTO doesn't matter. We don't care about the WTO. You would highlight that what they were doing perhaps wasn't WTO compliant. It wasn't a concern. So it's true, the narrative matters and the approach matters. So doing it behind closed doors or being open about not supporting the global system under the WTO does create a difference. But in terms of the content of the policies and the impact of those policies, it doesn't change much. The one thing that it does, and it's not directly relevant to the book or anything, but it does put China under a light of responsible actor a lot more than it did before, right? So even though in terms of content, again, nothing has changed, it is much easier for China to come out of all of these as the global responsible actor that they've always claimed they are. Now, if the question is, we're going to see the end of the WTO in the next 4 years, I honestly don't know. The WTO has resulted much more resilient, even though, partially not functioning, largely not functioning, than I would have thought. So maybe it will survive anyways, but it's definitely one thing that I will say is that I find interesting that even China still brings cases in front of the WTO. Unlike the US, China brings cases in front of the WTO when it's unhappy. So let's see if there is a complete delegitimization, so nobody uses it anymore except for the European Union, or whether it's still going to be used as it is. The other point that I want just to mention, a lot of energies in the EU go into making things WTO compliant. I think a little bit too much energy goes into that particular aspect, especially considering everything that is going on.
So we have another interesting question. Returning to the FDI screening system in Europe with regard to security issues. So the scale and structure of Chinese direct investment in Europe is changing for many reasons. We know that on the one hand, is anyone monitoring Chinese investment in technology startups in Europe, for example, in Germany. How do you assess the disadvantages of the EU FDI screening system?
It's a great question. It's an excellent question. It's a conversation that we're having at the moment. What are we capturing investments in startups, scale-ups, spin-offs? And in certain cases, the answer is yes. If it is an acquisition, even of a startup, if the startup is a company, then yes, most screening mechanism will be able to capture that if, and again, this is important, if that startup operates in one of the sectors that are already listed in the regulation. Now, which are the two big problems? The first one is that in the previous regulation, emerging technologies were not necessarily the focus of the conversation. And now the review is thinking whether to include the list of strategic technologies in Annex 2, the list that was adopted by the European Commission in September, October 2023. Yes. I'm trying to remember everything that happened. And that has a list of the 10, I think, critical technologies. Now, there are lots of objections about that. Some don't want it because they don't want to have a list imposed by the EU. Others don't want it because the list lists too generic technologies and therefore is too broad, too difficult to implement, and is not very useful. So that is sort of issue number one that we're currently facing. Issue number two, in some cases, these are not merger and acquisitions. In some cases, these can be greenfield investment, joint ventures, different types of indirect investments as well, especially if they are spin-offs from universities. So in those cases, no, the regime doesn't capture it. And this is the ongoing conversation that is happening in relation to the review at EU level. How do we capture all these different types of investments? Do we want to capture them? And then if we do, how do we capture these different types of investments? Again, all of this, however, creates a major issue, which is currently we're still focusing on national security and public order. If we include economic security, what do we mean by economic security? Because we cannot simply adopt what is written in the economic security strategy of the European Union, which is an operationalization of economic security, but there's not like a two-liner of what exactly economic security is and covers. Not that not the other countries do, by the way. Nobody wants to settle on a definition of economic security. And then secondly is, how do we capture dual-use technologies? Do we use end use? End use is no longer as reliable as it used to as one of the characteristics. So there are lots of questions, which means basically that I didn't answer the question of how does this disadvantage the EU? The one thing that I can say is not a disadvantage of the EU alone. It is a complex conversation that is happening everywhere in trying to understand how do you treat technologies in these restrictive measures and what type of technologies you should restrict and how. So it is an ongoing conversation. If you're interested in this, just keep an eye on what comes out of the European Parliament in terms of position for the review of FDI screening and then the negotiations with the European Commission and the Council.
Wonderful. Well, one final question, I promise. What specific coordination on counter strategies against China do you expect on economic security between the US and EU? Any hope for transatlantic coordination?
Yeah, I'm truly sorry. It's really difficult to say at this point, because I barely have any indications of what is the type of approach the US would have towards China. In terms of expectations, I honestly expect US extraterritoriality to become much more present and much more stronger. Now, again, one of the last actions of the Biden administration was the AI diffusion regulation, which had a very strong extraterritorial component and also a very strong subdivision of who in the world was trusted, who was sort of in between, and who was not trusted. But I do expect a lot more extraterritoriality, which, to a certain extent, I suppose that the big question mark is, will the EU have to follow what the US does in some areas because of legal constraints, or will it be able to coordinate? Coordination, which, again, I want to stress, was already difficult with the Biden administration.
Well, I think we'll leave it at that because we are approaching the end of today's discussion. But I especially want to thank Dr. Francesca Goretti for sharing with us your expertise on the state of EU-China economic relations and its broader implications on transatlantic economic relations. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope our audience did too. I want to especially thank our audience members who engaged with us in this timely discussion, especially the questions asked. I wish you all a wonderful week, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you very much. Thank you.